But I'm very excited about this evening's program, and thank you everybody for joining us. Our topic is artificial intelligence and journalism, real writers. And we've talked about AI once before, but I can tell you we're going to be talking about AI a lot. And I think every chance we have an opportunity to learn about this thing, which keeps changing and growing as we go on, we need to embrace that. So we're very fortunate to have Edward Hasbrouck with us today. And when I say with us, he's with us from a Shiloh Inn on the Snake River in Idaho Falls. So he also is not quite as far as Wanda and Jules and Effen, but he's coming to us from a distance too. About Edward, he is a longtime BATW member. He is the author of the acclaimed Practical Nomad series of travel books. He is a self-publisher and blogger, and the winner of a Lowell Thomas Travel Journalism Award in the Investigative Reporting Travel News category. Edward was one of the witnesses invited to testify at the U.S. Copyright Office listening session in 2023 on generative AI and writing. He's a member of the Generative AI Working Group of the National Writers Union and a contributor to the NWU's Platform and Principles for Policy on Generative AI. He's also a member of the Task Force on Generative AI of the International Federation of Journalists, the sole U.S. member of the IFJ's Authors' Rights Expert Group, and a former member of the board of the International Federation of Reproduction Rights Organizations, where he held the sole seat on IFRRO's board, reserved for representative writers in all genres worldwide. So he knows from whence he speaks. So I'm going to welcome Edward and let him take it from here. Thank you, Edward.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you to all of you for being here, taking the time, and putting up with the last-minute change in dates to accommodate something that would have been hard to compete with last night. I want to talk to you about what generative artificial intelligence is and how that shapes how we can use it and the problems and the potential. I first need to give some background on what generative AI is and how it works, because I think that shapes a lot of these other questions. In particular, what are the inputs that AI uses to generate its output? And based on that, what can AI do? What is it good for? And what can't it do? And what is it not good for? Trying to advance these slides, and they're not advancing. There we go. This is actually a copy of my birth certificate, which says father's occupation, computer program. No, it doesn't really mean that I'm the product of generative AI. It means that back in 1960, when I was born, even the city clerk's office in Cambridge, Massachusetts, then the center of computer technology, didn't know what a computer programmer was. But I have been, working with computers for a long time. That does not mean that I'm a programmer or a technical expert, but it does mean that I've seen an evolution. And while current generative AI may seem like something that came out of nowhere and is tremendously different, and in some ways it is, but it's also an incremental stage in a set of processes involving interactive text-based computer interfaces that have been evolving for decades. The computing moved for the first time from batch processing to an interactive command line interface in the 1960s. And that meant you could actually type something on a teletype and a response would be typed back on that same teletype. And almost immediately thereafter, people began to experiment, once it developed that interactive quality, with trying to get the computer to respond in ways that would seem human-like. ELIZA was this simulation of a non-directive therapist that would echo back whatever you expressed to it, mixed with an extremely limited repertoire of stored phrases. But it actually was quite persuasive, even as early as the mid-60s on a teletype, in making people think they were typing and getting answers from a real person. So there is this long-standing tendency to anthropomorphize the computer in this interactive mode. A big breakthrough in what has led to current large language models and generative AI systems like ChatGPT was the image models for optical character recognition. Those started out in as early as 1970s with the first Kurzweil reading machine, which would take an image of a page or a text and would, based on stored images of a lot of letters, would in fact calculate which of those stored letters most resembled the letter in the image and substitute it and thereby generate computer text for the image. And as early as the early 1980s, I was working for a service bureau that was scanning books with this kind of AI image recognition to generate text that could then be edited to produce a new edition without having to rekey the whole book. This moved to speech starting in the 1990s with speech recognition software, where, again, you would talk and the computer would store samples of your voice. And then based on that, when you spoke to it, it would try to match and see which of the stored words or phonemes most closely matched what was in its language model. The first voice recognition systems, you had to talk like this because they would only try to match one word at a time. Then as the language model got larger, the breakthrough was Dragon Naturally Speaking in the late 1990s, where they had the storage capacity, the larger language model, and the processor speed to try to match on a whole string, a phrase or a sentence at a time. And it got dramatically, although more resource intensive, dramatically more accurate. And I actually, as early as 1999, 2000, was dictating the manuscript to one of my books into Dragon Naturally Speaking. It still needed to be edited, but it was good enough to be useful. So now we're seeing a further step where with the latest generative AI systems, they're not just trying to calculate a match, a probabilistic match to samples for what the input was, but a probabilistic match to what response or sequence followed that would be most likely to follow that input based on the material in its stored language model. And so that response to the prompt is actually a probabilistic generation of, based on the patterns in the input, what would be most likely to follow. And the big breakthrough there, of course, was ChatGPT. And I'll say, I'm going to be talking a lot about text and ChatGPT as an example. Many of you are also photographers, probably also using generative AI tools for images. They even exist for video. But I'm going to focus, because we're writers, on the particular example of ChatGPT as the best known and the largest language model, I think, at this point of the text-based generative AI. So when we say that the AI interactively generates text, it doesn't create anything, it doesn't write it, it interactively generates text. What does that mean? You input a prompt, and it outputs a text. You might input, write a story about creation, and the output would be in the beginning, and so forth and so on. So this seems superficially, and our brain is tempted to make this think like it's a conversation with a humanoid, but it's really a computer executing commands. And so the question is, what's inside that black box? What is this computing? What's it doing here? You look at the OpenAI headquarters at 18th and Folsom, and you don't think like this is the headquarters of a $100 billion corporation. Where's the $100 billion? What's going on here? Is the secret sauce all in some magic code? Well, actually not. It's not really in the code so much at all, but it's pretty much a black box. It doesn't really tell you what's going on. Now, when you're using ChatGPT, it looks like this diagram. You, the writer, give a prompt to ChatGPT and you get an output. And it's really easy when you do that to assume that your prompt generated the output. You did the work. You put an input, told it something, and you got the output. And it's easy to think that your work as writer was done with the prompt, and that the output, this is just a tool, a machine that's acting on your prompt. But that's not really what's happening. I promise you, I'm not going to torture you with flowcharts. This is by far the most complicated, but it's also the most important diagram. And what I've tried to show here is the various inputs and the people who are producing those inputs, so we can see the labor flow. And then I'll also talk a little about where the money flows. But first, let's talk about the labor flow. What goes into that input? Because there's a lot of invisible inputs that are combined with your prompt to generate the output. Over on the left is that simplistic path. You, the writer, are giving the prompt to ChatGPT and it's outputting text. But you also see on the second column, there's this huge number of other writers, maybe including you, but millions of others, who've written other things that have been ingested or used to train. But again, train is a way too anthropomorphic a word for many people to be comfortable with. So let's say these training documents that other people have written have been mathematically analyzed to convert them to tokens, which are basically mathematical representations from which you can recreate the original text, but it's a mathematical representation of the input text. And this huge volume of billions of pages of text written by tens of millions of people has been tokenized and stored in this giant database, the large language model. And that is interacting with ChatGPT. So all of this other work done by all of this other people is being combined with your input in the prompt to produce the output. But there are other people producing other inputs too. There's a bunch of moderators. These are typically in some global south, digital sweatshop being paid very little, who are hired as moderators to try to weed out the obscene, the pornographic, the violent, the obviously false or fake. They can do a limited amount of that just because they're human and the volume is so large, but they can do some minimal things. They may also be able to make some decisions to say, well, for example, I want to give a higher weight in the language model's probabilities to input that we've sucked in from the New York Times because we think that that's more valuable and more like people want more output that's like the New York Times than they want more output that's like, clickbait. So there are these moderators and their work is being incorporated as part of the input. And there also are some programmers who've written the code that carries out this compilation and combination and regurgitation. But the key thing here again is that all of these other workers, other work is being incorporated as part of the input that you don't see. And so your prompt is only a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of the massive volume of input that's going in to generate this. There's also a flow of money. And I think one of the key questions to ask yourself in thinking about whether it's appropriate to be using these tools is whether the shares of money received by the various contributors to this output correspond to the shares of value they use. Now, the creators of the training material, these tens of millions of people who've written billions of pages that have been ingested, have all been paid nothing and are being paid nothing. You, the user, you're inputting a prompt, which may have a greater or lesser degree of creativity, but you're inputting just that prompt that's being added to those billions of pages, and you may or may not be making money from the output. The moderators there are a fair number of them, but they're being paid very little. The programmers, there are a few of them, they're being pretty well paid. And then you've got a tiny number of investors who are making billions. So is that fair? Ask yourself. The revenue, there's real money here. This is not some startup with zero revenues. Not only has OpenAI alone, which is the company that developed ChatGPT, with particular investment from Microsoft, but others, that's generated 100 billion or more in asset value to the stockholders. The stock is locked up, it'd be hard to sell it, but real value. There's also revenue, actual revenue. You can use the free version of ChatGPT, but already on the order of 10 million people have signed up to pay $50 a month to use the premium version, which uses ChatGPT 4 rather than ChatGPT 3.5. The big difference is a larger language model. So that's revenues. The numbers, round numbers, certainly in the billions of dollars a year in actual revenues that are flowing through. And again, where is that money that people are paying? Is it going back to the people who've actually generated the value? So again, investors making $100 billion or more. A lot of money has gone into data centers. This is not just like building code, writing code. This is actually very brute force, hardware intensive kind of work. This is not the secret sauce is the code. The secret sauce is massive volumes of, real hardware resources and operations. some amount of money, much smaller for programmers and the moderators, and as I said, zero going through to the creators. I talked about the hardware costs. Most of the work you don't see, but I had the opportunity, I was giving a talk at Iowa State University last year, flew into Des Moines, and even as you land, you see off the end of the runway in Des Moines, these giant data centers, the largest of which is the main ChatGPT training center run by Microsoft on behalf of OpenAI, one of the 5 largest publicly disclosed supercomputers in the world. I drove, this is a view just across the field outside the airport. I drove around, it's between half a mile and a mile and a side. It's cost about $2 billion. And when I say resource intensive, it's not just constructing this. Crunching these numbers at this scale makes this single computer the largest user of electrical power and of water in Greater Des Moines. So you may, and when you're using this, you are directly contributing to this resource usage. So, if you think about the carbon footprint and the resource footprint of flying to a destination to write about it, do you also think about the resource footprint of using ChatGPT to write about it? Because that's actually really substantial. And while the electricity hasn't that much been a controversy, there's begun to be increasing controversy. When I was in Des Moines, it was starting to make the papers because there was a drought going on and people were realizing that, wait a minute, what is our water being sucked up for? You might wonder, why are they using so much water? It's because this computer contains somewhere in the millions of processors crowded together as closely as possible so that the signals between them have the least distance and time to travel. And they're crowded together as closely as they can without overheating. From the outside, almost all you see is the pumps that are pumping cooling water through to keep the whole thing from overheating and exploding. But this is what they're using to digest, to ingest all of this written stuff and convert it into tokens that become part of this gigantoid language model database. So anyway, that's some of what's happening. And what happens with the code and the interaction is, as I said, that it takes this giant language model and tries to calculate what is the closest probabilistic follow-up to, based on the language model, to the prompt that you've given it. So what's it good for and what's it not good for? Well, here are some features that are directly a product of what I just described about how this works. It reproduces only the patterns that are either from your prompt or from the training material that's been ingested or the rules that the programs have programmed in. It can't get anything from anywhere else. So that's what it's reproducing. Because there's nothing creative or original and cannot be any, it can't be copyrighted. And that's not my decision. That's the US Copyright Office's ruling, I think rightly, but that is their ruling. That also means that all of the prompts and the output can be freely copied by anyone without your permission or credit or payment. And that's actually in the ChatGPT user terms that if you are using it. So for example, if you are revising a document or you ask ChatGPT, I'm going to upload a file, please rewrite this. You are giving ChatGPT and OpenAI permission to ingest your draft, which could mean that it could be regurgitated entirely and unedited to the next ChatGPT user. You've given permission for that. So you shouldn't input your draft unless you're willing to have it be freely reusable by any other ChatGPT user. Any private information you might put in can become public.
And I'm going to hold some questions, but we're going to have some really interesting questions. I'm assuming you want to wait till the end for that.
Yes, I think that would be better. I think that would be, if you're willing.
Carry on.
So this is a statement. I'm going to give you a couple of statements. I was involved in the working groups that produced these, I'll be honest, but these are larger international bodies that have been studying this, that sick their experts on this question to think about what this means for writers. This is from the International Authors Forum. Generative AI generates its output to replicate as closely as possible the patterns in the work it has ingested as input. Whether those inputs or outputs are true is not a factor in its language models or its generative algorithms. By design, it will generate output that replicates the falsehoods, the myths, and the misunderstandings that are most common in the input. By design, it will generate output that replicates as closely as possible the biases and bigotries in the input. because generative AI generates input that is as consistent as possible with the patterns in the output that is as consistent as possible with the patterns in the input, it will by design produce output that seems as plausible as possible, regardless of its truth or falsehood. And I would just add parenthetically that even if you say, we want you to give more weight to articles in the New York Times, a particular phrase may appear in the New York Times because some public figure, who shall perhaps remain nameless, said it, even though it's a lie, but it's being talked about. And the language model doesn't know whether that sentence appeared in the New York Times because it was being talked about as a prominent lie or because it was truth. The probabilistic model has no concept of truth. This is similar vein from the International Federation of Journalists. Generative AI language models contain no information about truth, only about what occurs frequently in the input material. Such models cannot engage in fact-checking or assess the weight and credibility of sources. They cannot seek out new sources or balanced perspectives. Generative AI outputs tend to reproduce the biases and myths that are most common in the input materials. And I would also say, with particular interjecting here, particularly with respect to travel writers, I think one of the particular problems, especially if we're working internationally, is that because the input material mostly comes from what's available, and that is naturally from writers in the global north, because we get published, our stuff gets online. And so the patterns in what's said about a particular place that are in the inputs to ChatGPT are going to be what first world people going to the third world said about that third world country. So it's going to reproduce a colonialist, or with respect to Asia, for example, an Orientalist kind of bias. And it's particularly going to be biased against the local perspectives because they're less likely to show up in the input corpus. So if we want, to skew towards listening to local voices, ChatGPT is going to go just the reverse. And all of this, I would say, it's significant to note, this is all feature, not bug. This is by design. This is the natural consequence of the way it's built to work. And there's some of these lengthier statements, which I'll refer you to. These slides, there'll be a link in the chat. They're also on my website, and you can look at these in more detail. Some guidelines for using it. But there are some places I think that it's actually really useful precisely, again, because of these features. If you want to find out what are the best known things to see in Destination X, because you're writing about it, again, the patterns in this input of what has already been written are going to tell you what are the most talked about things. Whether they should be or not, who knows? But if you want to know what those are so you can focus on them or tell people this is a popular thing, but it's mistaken, or it's a tourist trap, don't waste your time on it, it'll at least clue you into what their expectations are that they expect to see in an article about Destination X or Topic X. It'll tell you what the descriptions and the stereotypes are of a people or a community, or the people in a place, or about the place itself, so that you can address those or at least be conscious. If you want to sensitize yourself and write to your audience, ChatGPT is a great tool for learning about what expectations your audience is bringing to your readership, is bringing to your writing. Similarly, you can play free association. What's the first thing that comes to mind? And finally, what things are the most hackneyed and overused, so that you can avoid them, or you can figure out, is an editor going to say, look, this has been done a million times, or is this in fact something that there's not a large body of material about, either because it's new or hasn't been focused on. So it can help you to find topics and avoid overworked ones, or ones that an editor is going to reject quickly as overworked. But I also want to talk about not just how you can use AI, but also about how your work is being used. Remember, I said tens of millions of people, possibly including you, have written things that have been used by AI and are being part of the input that is being used by other people who use ChatGPT, whether or not you know that. These include whole libraries of pirate ebooks, where if you've written something that's in a book that has an ebook edition, there's a good chance that it's been pirated, and the pirate ebook has ended up in this massive database that's been sucked in by a lot of the AI companies. If you have anything that's been published on the web, it's likely been scraped up by web crawlers. The Internet Archive has been copying both books and websites. It's unclear whether those copies have been used. That's the subject of some lawsuits. I don't want to go too far down that rat hole. But not only do they reproduce bootleg copies of make ebook editions from books that never had an ebook edition and not pay for them, but they actually put entire books on the web with a unique URL for each page, one web page for every page of every book. And there's a good chance that those could be scraped up. And while I'm talking mostly about text, there also are some tools like haveibeentrained.com will search some of the databases of images that have been used for AI training, so you can figure out like if your photographs have been scraped up by these systems. This is really interesting. The Washington Post did a sort of reverse engineering of one of these databases that have been used, and not by OpenAI for ChatGPT, but used by Google to train its AI to figure out what websites they'd scraped. And they've got a tool on this Washington Post article. The link is in that slides. So I put in, my website. You can put in the domain name and see how much from that website has been scraped into Google's AI training, and where does it rank? Well, my website ranks 60,000, which out of all the websites in the world is pretty damn high. I was not pleased. There are 300,000 tokens that have been extracted from my website and entered into the language model for Google's AI, which basically means the entirety of the text of all of the couple thousand pages on my website have been appropriated by Google and could be spat back out to any user of their AI. But whether or not you can find these things, what can I do about it? If you discover or you suspect that your work has been sucked into these AI systems, supposedly there are ways to opt out. That's their sort of, well, if you don't like it, you can just complain, and after the fact, we'll stop doing it. Of course, we've already copied your entire website, but we won't copy new stuff, which is really not very effective, even if you could do it. Without going too far into the technical nightmare, I'm fairly technical, and I had a really hard time implementing all of the different ways that different AI companies have said they want you to tell them if you don't want further use of their work. And I suspect that for most normal writers and most people in this group, it's not going to be possible. It's going to take more than that. So in the meantime, it's likely that your work is getting used. These are some of the tools that you can use, particularly for web content. Again, I'm not going to go into that too much detail. We can talk if people want. But it's also the case that money may be getting paid. You're not getting paid, but publishers who've published your work may well. And, less sophisticated publishers may not have known, even they as publishers may not have known how to implement these measures to keep their content from being scraped up by AI crawlers and then spat back out, regurgitated to other users of ChatGPT. But the more sophisticated publishers are realizing there's value in this, and they're cutting deals for substantial amounts of money to license material that they've published, including perhaps stuff that you've written, to AI companies. Now, are they sharing any of that revenue? Almost certainly not. And they probably aren't even telling you. And this is part of a larger problem that groups like the National Writers Union have been working on for years, which is that each time new technology unlocks new value in writers' personal backlists, there's a fight over who's going to get that. Is that new value to your work that means your work is more valuable and you should earn that money? Or does it mean somebody who previously published it gets to piggyback without paying you anymore and generate more revenue from your work and not pay you? What's going on here? How do you find out what's going on? Are publishers getting money for your work to which you should be entitled to a share? Well, that depends on your contracts. So you have to read your contracts. And I know that with the NWU, when we get grievances, a large percentage of them arise because people either didn't have a written contract or didn't read it. One of the really good things that's happening, there is legislation on Governor Newsom's desk now. I don't know if he's going to sign it, but it's gone through the legislature on his desk that would mandate written contracts for all freelancers, including writers, which would have to spell out what rights you are granting, not just we're paying you this for this article, but for what uses of this article and what future uses of this article. The experience has been that publishers particularly will interpret catch-all clauses. If there's something about all rights or all rights to future uses or all technology now or ever invented, they're probably going to interpret that as including they've already paid you their one-time fee and they can generate more revenue from it in more ways. That's both a political question, an organizing question, but it's also a question, a legal question. You may not be able to do too much about past work, but it's really important particularly if you do hold those rights, to look and keep an eye out if there are publications where you've published a lot of work, whether you had a book published or you write a lot for a particular website or magazine. Google them in AI and see every day there are new deals being cut by publishers selling in bulk rights to use for AI, ingestion for AI, and regurgitation by AI to the whole body of everything they've published, often with complete disregard for whether they hold those rights. And in the future, of course, it's really important to look out for whether new contracts you're given include a clause that might now start to either explicitly include AI or, again, have this kind of all rights catch-all clause where that's going to grant more rights and enable the publisher to make more money off your work. And of course, that's a negotiating question with a contract of, well, okay, you've changed your contract for this publication and you're adding these additional rights. Fine. How much more do you want to pay me for them beyond what your rate used to be? If they're getting more and they're going to generate more revenue, and again, there's real money coming through. Like I said, even aside from the investment value, we're talking billions of dollars a year that OpenAI alone is taking in from these subscription licensing fees for users of ChatGPT. They've got billions of dollars to play with. Even flowing that through to a very large number of writers, that could be meaningful. How to make that happen? That's another question, but at least look for those clauses in your contracts going forward. We probably have a lot of questions by this point. I do want to stop here, but I'll say one thing here. I know this is the BATW, and I tremendously value the contributions that fellow BATW members have made to me and others as mentors in writing and as guides to the writing business. But I hope that if this raises some further questions about the kind of organizing struggle, and many of these things are not things that are that amenable to sort of individual self-defense against being exploited and having your work ripped off and having other people generate more money from your work, or putting you in a position where you're inadvertently ripping off other writers. If any of those things are organizing issues, they're political issues, they're labor issues, they're workers' rights issues, and I hope that you will consider, as I know quite a number of BATW members have in the past, and some still are, that you'll consider also joining the NWU and getting involved, because while I think BATW does a commendable job, and I'm really grateful for that, and I hope it goes forward in helping people write, I also want there to be a situation where writers, including travel writers, can make enough money to stay in this business. And we have to really organize for our economic rights to make that happen. So with that, I will stop and try to address as many questions I have in whatever time folks are willing to stick around.
Edward, thank you so much. I've been watching the chat and expecting lots of questions. And frankly, there's just been a few, because I think you have blown our minds. And we are just overwhelmed with what the knowledge and the information that you've just shared with us. What I'd like to do is let's go ahead and stop sharing your screen so we can see each other, and we can let people speak with you directly. But I could have a question myself, and I don't know if it's relevant for writers, but is there such a thing as, can you reverse AI? In other words, if I'm reading something that I believe, how do you find the sources in something that's generated by AI? Is there, obviously there's not footnotes, or are there? How can you find this stuff?
You can't, and that's part of the problem. It is deliberately designed so that you can't. There's an argument that is illegal, that's actually a violation of international authors' rights treaties, that independently of your economic rights, give you a moral right to be credited when your work is used. The US, which generally has a low respect for international human rights, hasn't implemented that, although we signed the treaty. But there's no certain way to figure out what the sources are, and that's part of the problem. So if you want to credit the sources, you can't.
Okay. Let's see. Rosie, you had a couple good questions. Did you get your questions answered, do you think? Do you have any other questions?
Well, oh, am I muted? No. Just then, is it considered plagiarism if you use AI material?
It could be. Again, because you don't know the source, you don't really know whether the output you received was something that's combined out of 10,000 other things that other people wrote, or whether in fact it is regurgitated word for word entire paragraphs or pages from something somebody else wrote. In the lawsuit that the Authors Guild has brought against OpenAI, they've included multiple examples of cases where people put in a prompt and they got out page or more length, word for word reproduction of published books. So if you use the output, you don't know whether that's where the output came from. So it does, I think it places real questions on whether you can, satisfy your own obligations about plagiarism, or whether you're taking a risk if you sign a warranty for, which is included in a typical publishing contract that says, I warrant that this is my original writing. Can you do that with the output of ChatGPT? I think is a very questionable thing.
Mm-hmm. So we don't really know. You'd have to follow a legal pursuit of that.
Yes, and that's one of the things that both the European Commission and the U.S. Copyright Office and the U.S. Congress are all looking at legislation that would mandate some degree of disclosure. The AI companies said, well, we've already spent billions of dollars building these language models, and we didn't keep track of the sources, so we can't retroactively add credits, and we'd have to start over. Well, maybe they should start over and do it right. But at this point, what they're saying is, oh, you'd be throwing away billions of dollars of our work if we had to start over and do it keeping track of credits.
For this, once again, photography, this is being scraped up too. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little for me. My internet connection is poor. What'd you say?
And no, we had a question about, is photography getting swept up into all of this? And I think you said that it was.
Absolutely. No, and in fact, some of the strongest voices against this have been raised by photographers. I mean, I think, I can't say which is the worst problem, but it's definitely a severe problem. And I think there are two things going on. One is that existing stock photography is being used without payment to train. Particularly if anything has gone to a stock agency or it's been published, it's likely been scraped off the web and is being used to train these image AIs. And the other thing is that even more quickly than writers being replaced by AI, the efforts to replace writers with AI that some newspapers have made have produced such nonsensical garbage that they haven't been that effective, but it's much more quickly happened that image AI has begun replacing licensing of stock photos, and has devastated stock photo licensing revenues, not so much for journalistic use, but for commercial use. You want a photo to use or an image to use in an advertisement, instead of bothering to pay a stock photo agency, you can customize, get the AI to customize an image for you that probably is derived from something that, a stock photographer spent a lot of money and expertise developing, but you're not paying for it. And so that's an extreme concern for the stock photography agency. And people want to be able to reuse their photos again in the future.
Edward, I'm on the PR side of this, and I find myself asking a really kind of silly question, like, how do I get my press releases into AI? If there's this whole big brain, I can send my press releases, my news, my information to an editor and so on, but they may or may not print it. Is there a way to get my information straight into AI if I so wanted to?
Well, again, here's where the companies say, and this is the same thing Google says about how do you get your stuff ranked high in a Google search? Well, Google doesn't want to disclose their algorithms because if they did, people would game them. And the AI companies say the same thing. A, the algorithms are our secret sauce, and B, if we disclose them, people would game them, because everybody wants their stuff to be some people don't want their stuff to be repeated because they see it as creative work, but a lot of sort of information providers, whether they're PR agencies or whether they're politicians or whether they're professional manipulators and liars, whoever those might be, they're all trying to game the AI to output their answers to the questions that people are using. So, it's all people are trying to reverse engineer it, but there's nothing publicly disclosed in any meaningful way about what those algorithms are.
Edward, I have a question.
Please.
A few years ago, you were sounding the alarm and gave a talk to BATW that we really appreciated on working in the gig economy and the new laws that were coming down the pike to try to restrain that. The newspapers and magazines were saying we couldn't be hired for more than a few articles because otherwise they'd have to pay us benefits. And we formed a bit of a coalition with BATW. And I know you did a lot with your organizations, and it was defeated, I believe, so that writers are not involved in the fight over whether or not we can, sell our freelance work and have to be offered benefits, things like that. That's my understanding, is that we won that battle. I'll let you kind of define that a little bit more, but I just know in my case, I was working for Diablo Magazine, and they were really concerned with limiting my number of articles. And then all of a sudden they said it wasn't going to be relevant anymore.
I didn't come prepared to talk about this, and it's a detailed and technical thing, and it's not so much my focus. I mean, that has been a focus of California law, and it is something that the Northern and Southern California chapters of the NWU have been involved with. I think it's much less clear-cut and a little different than what you described, partly because publishers are saying, we can't afford to hire you as an employee because then we'd have to pay you a living wage. Well, are they all going broke? Not necessarily. I think this is really about the distribution of money. And partly, the news business is being squeezed. The publishers are being squeezed by both the AI companies and the internet platforms that are, copying news articles onto Facebook, and Facebook isn't paying for them, and copying them into Google searches. So people just read the summary in Google News and don't go to the website. So the website isn't getting the ad revenue. Google's getting the ad revenue for the article that came from someplace else. So they've diverted a lot of the revenue that might otherwise have flowed through authors. I'm really skeptical of those claims that they couldn't afford to pay people a living wage. That's just, there have been increasing efforts to organize and unionize among writers for a number of digital publications. The state of the law in California remains in flux. At this point, it is true that there is a broad but not complete exception to what actually was a positive pro-labor ruling, that people who were really employees couldn't be misclassified as gig workers in order to deny them benefits and pay them less than minimum wage. It's a less than optimal solution. And I think one more thing I'll say about that, other than to say that it's a mess, and that it's been fought out in legislation what I say is it's a mess, and it's been fought out in legislation rather than in collective bargaining. And I think the real underlying problem, which has not yet been addressed, is that although writers groups, including BATW and including the NWU, have been active in Sacramento and other states, and now there's some moves on this in Congress as well, in lobbying on this. But if we were normal workers, it wouldn't be going on in Congress, it'd be going on in collective bargaining sessions. And the real problem is not so much that that freelancers aren't getting paid minimum wage. The real problem is that the labor law makes it difficult and doesn't give us the same rights to collective bargaining. There's actually a threat that's been made periodically, probably invalid, but at least chills organizing, that has in the past been used, that for freelancers to try to organize and bargain collectively would constitute monopolism and a restraint of trade and run afoul of the antitrust laws. One of the things that we've been working for, the NWU, is an exception to the antitrust law to allow collective organizing and collective bargaining by writers, because I think actually we'd get a much better deal that would get us the working conditions and terms that we want and decent pay if it were carried out rather than through collective bargaining between writers and publishers, rather than in Sacramento where, Uber and Lyft can basically buy the legislature.
Do you have a question?
And
I'm sorry.
Thank you for that, Edward. Yeah, that explained it much better than I did, and I appreciate that. I think my point was that BATW can be active on some of these things. I just, as a follow-up question, are you more concerned about how we could be ripped off by AI than all of this other legislation that we've had to face over the years? Do you think that we have the clout to fight this, to get some money for what we produced and has been scrubbed off the internet, and especially with you? I mean, my God, I can't believe how high you're ranked and how much they've stolen from you.
that was pretty, that was not a pleasant thing to see. I do think, one of the other aspects of these generative AI is because there's this feedback loop and all of the output and the prompts get fed back in, that, eating its own waste, shall we say, phenomenon means that the AI tends to regress if it doesn't have fresh input. So for all that is already taken in, and that may already be a lost cause, it does depend, and even the AI companies say they depend on fresh quality content. And as the people who actually, only we can create fresh quality content. AI cannot sustain itself solely from eating its own shit. So we do have power. I think it's only if we organize and wield it collectively. But I do think that going forward, we have the possibility. We're a long way. And I would also say, I think fundamentally, and again, I'm not speaking here for any organization, it's just my personal opinion of priorities about organizing. I'm less concerned about the AI companies specifically and their use than I am concerned about the web scraping and the creation of these vast databases of pirated content that are there for use or misuse by AI companies, whatever the next, technology for wringing value out of our personal backlists. Look, I'm 64 years old. I want to retire. I don't have a pension. My pension depends on finding ways to generate revenue out of the stuff that I've written over past decades. I value that. I want to keep that to myself, and I don't want it stolen. But I can't do that myself. That's going to take organizing. And we are not in the place we need to be because of, for lots of reasons. I think many freelancers see ourselves as very independent and individual and creative. And there's a myth that we don't need collective action because we're working independently, but we need collective action to make it possible for us to work independently, if that makes any sense.
Edward, I think Erin just posted something, and I'll ask her to bring it up to you. It's relevant to what you were just saying. Erin, are you there?
I am. Thanks. Yeah, it's so funny. It literally was like a kismet just now. So that's kind of what I was asking. At some point, look, what AI does is regurgitate or vomit back out stuff that's already there. So at some point, if new content isn't constantly being created, it's just going to start regurgitating the same information. I mean, am I incorrect in that? And so if that is indeed the case, then what's sort of the plan for the future on the part of the companies who have created AI? I mean, like they have to be aware of the fact that there's an end game at some point.
Well, I think they've reached kind of the limits in some ways in terms of what they can do with, scanning existing published books and scraping the existing internet. And so what they are actually looking for, they are looking for fresh content that they can license on an ongoing basis. Now, they're going to publishers, not to writers for that. They're hoping to license content in bulk going forward. So that's where, we have to fight it out either with them or with the publishers in the licensing terms to make sure that if they're paying publishers, and they are paying publishers increasingly large sums of money to address this problem of regression from the regurgitation problem, we need to make sure that we're getting a share of that money. But they are looking for licensing deals. The other thing, which gets even more arcane but is important, is are there possibilities for writers to bypass the publishers? Like, I have books that they're out of print. The rights have reverted. I own 100% of the rights to those published books. The publisher owns 0% of the rights. So are there ways that I could license those rights? As an individual, no. But are there platforms? Can we build platforms through which writers could band together to license our content? And again, this is something that does happen in other countries through collective licensing organizations, and that's part of the work I was doing representing writers with IFRO, the International Federation of Collective Licensing Organizations. We don't have that evolved very well in the US because of these antitrust problems. And so a lot of the groups and people who are looking at this see reform of the antitrust law to open up an exception for organizing together for collective licensing in the way that, for example, agricultural producers have an antitrust exemption for agricultural co-ops to collectively market the produce of independent farmers. We need an antitrust exemption so that independent writers can collectively market and license the body, not of one writer, but of thousands or tens of thousands or millions of writers, where that might actually get interesting to the AI companies and they might pay real money for it. But that requires a collective licensing platform that's only embryonic in the US, although it's one of these places where we can really see examples abroad of how that might work. And it does generate meaningful revenue for writers in some other countries, even as close a field as Canada.
Jules, did you have a question? Jules? Yeah, you're muted right now. There you go.
It's sort of an answer that's going to horrify you. I'm also, along with being a writer, I'm a psychotherapist and a few other things like that. And there's an outfit called PI, capital P, small I, which lets you have a therapy session with them. And I thought, of all the things that I do, all the things I can imagine, the one that's safe from all this artificial intelligence stuff is psychotherapy. And I was wrong. I've written about it. I'll share it with Edward. I've got your information, of course, and I'll share it with the group too. The answers that I got with the real therapy question were as good as, and often better than the ones that of people that I've trained who are psychologists and psychiatrists. Jesus, we're in some changing world. Edward, I'd love your thoughts on it.
Well, I think there's real danger in that. It may be that sometimes they're good, but what do you do when it screws up? I mean, there's a lawsuit that I just saw working its way through, just got decided in the Court of Appeals. It's unclear what's going to happen, where on TikTok, these algorithms recommended for a 10-year-old, recommended for you on TikTok, picked out algorithmically what would be most responsive to what you were watching and wanting in your profile, recommended for you a video showing how you could strangle yourself. And this 10-year-old strangled himself to death. I think there are real liability issues that are going to crop up that are going to make it very, I don't see AI psychiatry. You don't have to mess up that often, and have somebody, after you for things that the chatbot said that led them down the path to suicide. You're not going to have too many of those before the liability kills it off. That's my guess, but who knows? I mean, AI companies and internet companies, tech platforms generally, have been extraordinarily successful in evading liability for what they do so far. So we'll see where that goes.
Wow. Well, I think we are just about out of time. Does anybody have, I see Mary Jean has one question, and then I think we'll be out of time. Go ahead, Mary Jean, you're muted right now.
Sorry, I'm muted. There's my picture. I'm totally non-technical. Let me tell you, this is really bad. But what I've noticed, because I do a lot of Google searches, because I'm in the science medical field, I feel like in the last 6-8 months, the searches I'm getting are weak. They're not solid. They're mushed. They're something's wrong. I have to drill down. I have to go into the the scientific database of the journals to get any substantive information. It's yeah. So that's
Again, what this is, it's not a bug, it's a feature. They're designed to produce a plausible sounding answer that's consistent with the pattern of stuff in the input, and the input may include utter garbage, but it will sound plausible. And if a normal response to this question would include some citations, it'll include some plausible sounding citations. Academic librarians are getting people coming in, asking them to find references that don't exist. Because they've done a search and said the answer to your question is somebody wrote such and such a paper, and there is no such paper, there is no such journal, there is no such book. Or it doesn't, there is, but it didn't say that. But often it just didn't exist at all. And it's driving the librarians crazy.
oh wow.
Yeah. Hallucinating, right? That's
Yeah.
crazy.
But again, I think hallucinating makes it too anthropomorphic. I think if you think about it in terms of this probabilistic language model, you'll get a more realistic frame for conceptualizing and understanding what's going on. Because once you anthropomorphize it to a human, it's like, all we need is a better human. But there is no human. There is no truth. There is no fact. There's just probabilistic patterns in the input, generating output.
And now it's time to drink heavily. So we want to thank you. Thank you, Edward. This has been absolutely fascinating, and we really appreciate you taking us on a deeper dive into this. And I'm sure we will talk again. As always, the recording will be on the BATW YouTube channel, and Edward has provided his slides, so you'll have those there. And we just look forward to going down the next what's going to happen next. It's just absolutely fascinating. So with that, I'll let you go unless anybody wants to stay and chat on amongst yourself. But otherwise, have a lovely evening, and thank you again.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Wonderful, just wonderful. Have a great trip.
It's going wonderfully.
Great presentation. Thank you.